So we continue our virtual trips in Israel with a tale of two hills. And the two hills are this one, which if I say to you all, where is that? Almost all of you will shout out, Masada. Okay, and you'd be right. And if I said to you, where's that? You'd all shout out, it's a hill, I don't know. But anyway, that is Yodfat in the Lower Galil, and the stories of Yodfat and Masada are interlinked. And they're interlinked by this guy, who is Yosef ben Metidyahu. He was born in 37 CE. And he became in his life the famous historian Josephus Flavius, who I seem to remember when I was growing up, we had on our shelves at home. But when I looked in the library of the local shul, he certainly was not located there amongst all the rabbinical works there. And we'll have to understand why. Okay, so why do we like Josephus Flavius? Why is he a reliable source? And he's a reliable source based on his, he has a monopoly, because if we want to look at the events in Judea which preceded the Great Revolt of 70 CE, which led to the destruction of the temple, he is basically the only account we have of those events and the years that came afterwards. Otherwise, we're very short of sources and knowing what actually happened. However, as we'll see, Josephus Flavius is a turncoat, meaning he fled from the Jews and he became a Roman, which is obviously the reason why he would not be located in, certainly in religious libraries, he would not be located there. Josephus Flavius wrote 4 main books. The most important ones were the Jewish Wars and Antiquities of the Jews. He wrote both in Greek and in Aramaic. So he wrote both accounts, he wrote in Greek and Aramaic, not necessarily the same versions. However, the versions that we have are all translations of the Greek version, and perhaps the Aramaic versions that he wrote for his Jewish audience may have been different, we'll never know. And his writings were certainly not preserved by the rabbis, neither were they preserved by the Romans. In fact, if you look at other Roman historians of the time, they don't refer to Josephus, and it seems somewhat doubtful how important he was in the eyes of the Romans. But his writings were preserved by the church. And the reasons are because he wrote this. He wrote, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accepted the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many Greeks, and here's the punchline, he was the Christ, meaning that he was the Son of God. So here we have definite proof that Jesus was the Son of God. Probably not, because almost certainly this is a forgery that was inserted into Josephus's works at least 100 to 200 years after he lived. But at least it preserved his works. Okay, so he was, as I mentioned, he was born in 37 CE. He went off to Rome, and he came back. He was actually son. His father was a priest, but most of the priests at that time were Sadducees. But he actually became a Pharisee, so he was aligned with the rabbis. And when the revolts broke out in 67, he moved to the north, to the Galil, and he was given command of the rebels, or the Sicari, that were in the Galil fighting off the Romans. In the War of the Jews, Josephus describes how Vespasian gave the order that the city of Yodfat, should be entirely demolished and all its fortifications burned down. So now Yodfat, if you go there, it's a hill. There's a kibbutz there as well. But in those times, it seems like it was a major city. And the Roman legions managed to enter the fortified city after 47 days and captured, okay, and what happened? And Josephus describes how 40 people found their way into a cave. And Josephus tried to persuade them that it was right to save one's own life. when it could be done without dishonor, and it was a great sin to throw it away unless in open warfare against an enemy. But they ran at him from all sides with their blades at his throat, and finally he said, okay, he said, if we must die, let it not be by our own, but not by our own, but by each other's hands. Let us draw lots, and the one who draws the first lot will be killed by him. Whoever draws the second, and so on, until everyone dies. They readily agreed, and they drew lots, and each one bared his throat, and the next one killed him, until, and this is what Josephus writes, by fortune or by providence, who was left? You guessed it. The guy that came up with this great idea, he was left, and he surrendered to Vespasian, who accepted his surrender, put him in chains. But eventually, he witnessed 3 years later the destruction of the temple. He got carted off to Rome. He was basically released, and he became Josephus Flavius, so he was accepted as a Roman, and his job was to write down everything that was connected to the Jews, and also to act as a translator for the Romans. So he became a Roman. And now let's have a look at the more well-known story of Masada. And Masada, if we look at Masada in the 1930s and the 1940s, in this picture that you see on the left-hand side, you can see 7 young ladies who, they were Palmach scouts. And in those days, instead of young people sitting opposite the television playing PlayStation, they would go out with their sticks and their cover tembo, and it was very much believed that the way, if we wanted to have a land, this was before the establishment of the state of Israel, if we want to have a land, we need to go out there and we need to track the land and know the land. And the gentleman that you see at the bottom is a gentleman called Shmaria Gutman. He was originally born in Scotland, an archaeologist, and he was very much behind this movement of people going out. So these young ladies, they came down from the kibbutz of Ein Cherod up north. They took a bus to Kalia, and they walked overnight from Kalia. They climbed up Masada, and they spent the night at Masada around the campfire. And if you've got any funny ideas, they were accompanied by 120 young men. So, you know, don't get any ideas there. But anyway. Noise in background, Meryl, coming from you?
Yeah, sorry.
That's better. Okay, thank you. All right, so they, okay, so 1930s, Masada became very much of a symbol. By the way, Shimon Peres was also one of these young pioneers that climbed up Masada. And so to the siege in 73 CE. And if we want to know what happened, we need to revert to our old friend Josephus. And he writes this famous speech of the leader of the Sikari at Masada, who was Elazar ben Yair. This is what he wrote. My loyal followers, long ago we resolved to serve neither the Romans nor anyone else, but only God, who alone is true and righteous Lord of men. Now the time has come that forces us to prove our determination by our deeds. At a time like this, we must not disgrace ourselves. Hitherto, we have never submitted to slavery, even when it brought no danger for it, etc., etc. I'll skip a little bit. In our case, it is evident that that day break will end our resistance. Okay, the Romans, they built the Roman ramp, and they were going to break into the fort of Masada and kill the Jews that were there. But we are free to choose an honorable death with our loved ones. This our enemies cannot prevent, however earnestly that they may pray to take us alive, nor can we defeat them in battle. Let our wives die unabused, our children without knowledge of slavery. After that, let us do each other an ungrudging kindness, preserving our freedom as a glorious winding sheet. Okay, one thing, only let us spare our source of food. Don't destroy the food, so the Romans will know that we had food, we could have carried on living. It will bear witness when we are dead to the fact that we perished through want, not through want, but because as we resolved at the beginning, we chose death rather than slavery. Sounds familiar? Again, a suicide pact. and they were all going to bare their throats and kill each other. And how did Josephus know this? Because he was at Yod Fat, but he wasn't at Masada. He knew it because 2 women and 5 children survived to tell their story to Josephus. So we have 2 very similar accounts of these suicide pacts, and we need to ask ourselves the question, is Josephus Flavius a reliable source on Masada? Okay, so first of all, in 1965, the gentleman that you see in the middle, Yigal Yadin, who was the 2nd chief of staff of the Israel army, and he was also an archaeologist, he carried out a very, very extensive archaeological expedition on Masada. He published this book, Masada, and anyone who's around my age, this book I got for my bar mitzvah, and I don't think I ever opened it for at least 40 years. By the way, people that didn't want to buy you a decent present, what did they do? They bought you the bar mitzvah book, or they bought you this book, Masada by Yigal Yadin, and I got numerous copies. I never ever looked at it until now. But anyway, so the description of Masada by Josephus Flavius, the geography matches what Yadin found, and Josephus describes the fort. It also plus minus matches what the archaeological expedition found. And Yadin also found a pit with human remains, but he didn't find 900 bodies as Josephus described. 900 people died. He didn't find 900 bodies, but that could be explained away. The best piece of archaeological evidence that was found for this whole suicide pact was an ostraca, was a piece of pottery. They found many of these, but they found one with the name Ben Yair. And if you remember, the leader of the whole thing was Elazar Ben Yair. Coincidence? Maybe, but maybe not. This is a good piece of evidence for this whole suicide pact. Is the speech accurate? Probably not. It's very common for historians of that time to imagine what would be said by a leader, and they would not just relate pure history, they would relate a story. So Josephus had a similar story at Yod Fat. So I'm not saying he invented the whole suicide thing, but the actual speech of Elazar ben Yair, unlikely that he was told it by 2 women and 5, certainly not by the 5 children that survived. Okay, Masada through the ages. So this whole story of a suicide pact, of Jewish resistance, in the 1920s, Masada was viewed as the last refuge, a fort that could protect the Jewish people from the gathering storm of European persecution. And Masada was an allegory for Jewish settlement in Palestine. We saw in the 1930s, by the way, in the 1920s, going back, there was a famous poem by Yitzhak Lamdan, "Open your gate, Masada, and I, the refugee, shall enter." And the poem concludes, "Masada shall not fall again. Shenit Masada lo tipol." And that became a rallying cry, not just of the Palmach, not just of Shimon Peres, but also of the revisionists and of even groups that were on the right of Jabotinsky's groups like Abba Achimeir that we mentioned previously. And in the 1940s, remember, there were hundreds of thousands of Jews in Palestine facing Nazis that were advancing from Egypt. And the Masada became a symbol of the fact that as Jews, we would rather fight the Nazis. We would rather fight the Nazis at Masada or on the Carmel and not be sent to concentration camps. Okay, so again, it was an allegory to Jewish resistance. By the way, Masada, the story of Masada happened at Pesach, and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising also occurred around Pesach time. Okay, we mentioned the dig. All right, fine. And what you see at the bottom in the right-hand corner is a swearing-in ceremony for IDF units. For many, many years, IDF swearing-in ceremonies occurred at Masada. But from 1967, images of Israel changed. Now the images were images of the Air Force. the images of Moshe Dayan, of Uzi Narkis and Mota Gur going up to the Temple Mount, and Mota Gur announcing the Temple Mount is in our hands, and the famous 3 soldiers by the Kotel, and the symbol of Jews killing themselves, Jews committing suicide at Masada, became less relevant to the all-conquering image, for better or for worse, and the might of the Israel army. And hence, after 67, eventually the IDF stopped swearing in ceremonies at Masada. And that's the story of the 2 hills. And you're now unmuted. Just if we can, if anybody wants to ask a question, please go ahead, or make any comments.
What? Someone's asking a question, no?
Okay, so if no one, if no one wants to make any comments or ask a question, it's slightly difficult to ask questions because there's always someone that has some noise in the background, so it becomes a little bit problematic. So forgive me on that. But if anyone wants to ask questions, make comments, then please feel free to do it on the WhatsApp forum. Okay, that's a good forum, and I saw lots of people making comments or questions or whatever, and it stimulates debate, and that's a good place to do it. Okay, so that's it for this evening. And I wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom, and we will meet again at the same time, the same place on Sunday. If anybody else wants to invite any friends, please feel free to do that. I wish you all